Your job is just a hobby. Anyone could do it. My brother mocked my business in front of his in-laws. I smiled, secretly canceled all my services for the family reunion, and left for vacation. The next day, their huge event was an utter disaster, and an old archive box exposed their sins. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Vanessa Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for 13 years, I was the person who made my family look organized. Not because anyone officially appointed me, not because I volunteered every year. But somewhere along the way, everyone just decided that if there was a family event, Vanessa would handle it. And after enough years, assumptions start feeling a lot like obligations. The first text about that year's family reunion arrived in early April. Actually, it wasn't even about the reunion itself. It was from my Aunt Linda. Do we know if we're using the same registration setup as last year? I stared at the message. There hadn't been a single conversation about who was organizing the reunion. No planning meeting. No phone call. No. Hey Vanessa, would you be willing to help again? Just a question that already assumed I was in charge. A few minutes later, another message appeared. Vanessa, can you check venue availability? Then another. Can you send me the hotel options? By lunchtime, my phone looked like I'd been assigned a full-time project. I sighed and opened my laptop. Again. My event planning company was already entering its busiest season. Actual paying clients needed my attention, yet I spent half the afternoon researching hotel blocks for relatives who hadn't even RSVP'd. The funny part? Most of my family didn't think I had a real business. They knew I owned a company. They knew I had employees. But whenever they described my work, they'd say things like, Vanessa helps people throw parties, or she's really creative with decorations, as if I spent my days picking balloon colors. One afternoon, my cousin Emily stopped by the office. She was one of the few relatives who actually seemed interested in what I did. After looking around for a minute, she laughed. I honestly didn't realize your business was this big. Most people don't. Does the family know? Know what? That this isn't just party planning. I laughed. Apparently not. She shook her head. Honestly, Vanessa, the reunion wouldn't even happen without you. That simple acknowledgement felt surprisingly nice, because most years, nobody said anything. The reunion just happened. People showed up. They ate. They took photos. Then they went home. Nobody thought about the months of work behind it. The scheduling, the vendors, the logistics. The emergencies solved before anyone noticed them. Success makes work invisible. I learned that years ago. A week later, I drove to my parents' house for Sunday dinner. The reunion came up before we'd even finished eating. My father pointed his fork toward me. So what's the attendance looking like this year? Not hello, not how's business, attendance. About 200 confirmed so far. My mother nodded. That's good. We might need more tables. We probably will. Can you handle that? Of course, because somehow I always could. My mother wasn't trying to be cruel. That was the complicated part. She appreciated everything I did. But appreciation and expectation had become tangled together. She'd thank me while assuming I'd keep doing it forever. You're so good at these things, she always said. And somehow that translated into more work. After dinner, my younger cousin Noah helped carry dishes into the kitchen. As he passed me, he quietly said, "Thanks for doing all this reunion stuff every year." I smiled. No problem. But I noticed something. The younger relatives usually said thank you. The older ones usually didn't. The younger cousins saw effort. The older generation saw tradition. And traditions, apparently, ran themselves. Over the next few weeks, the planning intensified. Emails, calls, vendor questions, schedule changes, special requests. Every problem somehow found its way to me. One evening, I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had gone home. I had 3 projects open on my screen: a wedding, a corporate retreat, and the Carter family reunion. I opened my time-tracking software. Something caught my attention. I checked the numbers again, then a third time. For nearly a month, I had logged more hours planning the family reunion than I had spent on several actual paying clients. I leaned back in my chair. The numbers stayed right there on the screen. And for the first time that year, I found myself asking a question I'd never seriously considered before. How exactly had this become normal? I should have been focusing on a corporate retreat for one of my biggest clients. Instead, I was arguing with my aunt about potato salad. Not because I cared about potato salad, because she had decided 3 weeks before the reunion that the menu needed to change. Again. "We've always had the traditional version," I said. "Well, some people don't like it anymore." "Who?" A pause. "I don't know exactly." Of course she didn't. "Okay, I'll see what the caterer can do." "Wonderful," she said cheerfully, as if changing a menu for 200 people was as simple as ordering a different pizza. The second I hung up, another call came in, then another text, then another email. At some point, I stopped asking how every small issue found its way to me, because everyone knew I would deal with it. A few days later, one of the caterers emailed an updated invoice. The increase wasn't huge, just a few $100s. I forwarded it to the family planning group. No response. A day passed. Nothing. 2 days. Still nothing. The payment deadline got closer. I sent another reminder. Silence. By the end of the week, I paid it myself. Again. The amount wasn't the issue. The issue was that nobody even acknowledged it. Nobody asked who covered the difference. The invoice simply disappeared and everyone moved on, like it always did. That afternoon, my operations manager, Rachel, stopped by my office. Question. I already knew that tone. What? Are we billing the family reunion this year? I laughed, not because it was funny, because it wasn't. No. Not even partially? No. What about labor? No. Equipment? No. Staff time? No. Rachel leaned back. Vanessa, do they know how much this actually costs? I looked away. That hesitation answered her question. I've worked here 6 years, she said. I know. And every year half the staff helps with this thing. I know. We don't charge anything. I know. She wasn't criticizing me. If anything, she sounded protective. That somehow made it worse, because I didn't have a good explanation anymore. It's family, I finally said. Rachel gave me a look that said she disagreed but wasn't going to push. Okay. After she left, I sat staring at the door. The uncomfortable truth was that my employees respected my work more than some members of my own family. The reunion planning kept growing. Hotel room changes, extra guests, dietary restrictions submitted late, last-minute attendance updates. Every change created 3 more problems. One morning, I walked into a staff meeting and found 2 coordinators discussing family seating arrangements. Not client seating, family seating. I stopped and laughed. Sorry, one of them said. We were trying to solve the seating issue. The fact that my employees knew more about reunion logistics than some relatives felt ridiculous. Thank you, I said. You know you don't have to keep helping? One coordinator shrugged. We know. The other smiled. We help because we like you. That should have felt good. Instead, I felt embarrassed. My employees were donating their time because they cared about me. Meanwhile, some family members acted as if everything happened by magic. A few nights later, the family group chat exploded. 37 new messages. 2 relatives were arguing about room assignments. Others debated activities. Then my uncle tagged me. Vanessa will figure it out. 3 words. No question. No discussion. Just certainty. Vanessa, we'll figure it out. For the first time, that sentence irritated me more than it reassured me. A couple of weeks remained before the reunion. Client meetings filled my calendar. Deadlines stacked up. And somehow the reunion kept demanding attention every day. One evening, I finally made it home before dark. I had barely sat down when my phone rang. Mom. Hey, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. She sounded unusually careful. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather, the reunion, my schedule. Then I heard my father's voice in the background. My mother's tone shifted. And suddenly I knew this call wasn't really about checking in. Vanessa, she said softly, we wanted to ask you something. I sat up straighter. What is it? A brief silence followed. Then my father picked up the extension. And the first thing he said made my stomach sink. We've run into a little financial problem. The second my father said that, I knew where the conversation was headed. How little? Neither of my parents answered immediately. Finally, my mother cleared her throat. The plumbing company found additional damage. I sighed. Years earlier, a pipe had burst underneath their house. The repair costs kept climbing until I eventually wrote a check for $8,400 because they didn't have the money. My parents promised to pay me back. I told them not to worry about it. Nobody ever mentioned it again. Now my father explained the new issue. Different problem. Same conversation. What are you thinking? I asked. My mother hesitated. We were hoping you might be able to help. There it was. I told them I would think about it. My father sounded relieved before I'd even made a decision. That bothered me more than the request itself. A few days later, I met my cousin Emily for coffee. She asked about the reunion. Still carrying the whole thing? She asked. Pretty much. She shook her head. I don't know how you do it. The conversation drifted toward family finances. Then Emily casually said something that caught my attention. I didn't know you helped Uncle Robert with the plumbing situation. You knew about that? Only recently. I thought Grandma paid for most of it. I blinked. She genuinely believed that. Nobody had lied to her. The story had simply changed over time. Somewhere along the way, my part disappeared. That wasn't the last time it happened. A week later, one of my aunts was talking about Mason's legal problems from years earlier. Thankfully, everything worked out, she said. It did. She smiled. Your parents really stepped up during that time. I nearly laughed. She had no idea I paid more than $12,000 in legal fees when Mason was struggling. Most relatives never knew. The few who did seemed to have forgotten. The strange part wasn't losing the money. I'd made peace with that. The strange part was watching history slowly rewrite itself. Details disappeared. Contributions blurred together. Family stories became simpler than reality. One afternoon, another memory surfaced while I reviewed reunion expenses. A family loan, $16,000. Years ago, a debt dispute had nearly torn relatives apart. I stepped in because I was tired of the arguments. The crisis ended. Life moved on. Eventually, the story became about how the family got through it together. Together. That word suddenly felt very flexible. The reunion planning continued. Schedules changed. Guests updated reservations. The family group chat remained chaotic. Life kept moving. But I started noticing something. People remembered receiving help. They just remembered it differently. And every time I noticed it, I felt a little less eager to jump in and save the day. That weekend, my parents hosted another family dinner. The house was crowded. Kids ran through the hallway. The reunion came up, as usual. Someone mentioned all the work still left to do. My father pointed toward me. Vanessa's got it covered. Several relatives nodded. Of course she does. That seemed to be everyone's assumption. Mason arrived late with his wife and dropped into a chair. What are we talking about? The reunion. He grinned. Ah, Vanessa's annual stress project. A few people chuckled. I forced a smile. Then one of our cousins asked how business was going. Before I could answer, Mason spoke first. "Oh, she's busy making centerpieces and bossing caterers around." A couple people laughed. Not loudly, not comfortably, just enough. I looked around the table. Nobody corrected him. Nobody mentioned the company, the employees, the contracts, the clients. Several relatives suddenly found their plates very interesting. And Mason leaned back in his chair like he'd just made the funniest joke of the night. Nobody corrected Mason. That bothered me more than the joke itself. Not because I expected everyone to defend me, but because the silence felt familiar. The conversation moved on almost immediately. Someone started talking about vacation plans. Someone else asked about the reunion schedule. Just like that, my business became a punchline and everyone acted like nothing had happened. I stopped trying to explain what I actually did years ago. People heard what they wanted to hear. A few days later, I was reviewing hotel reservations when another family group chat notification appeared. Mason had posted photos from a weekend trip. Luxury resort, golf course, expensive restaurant. The comments started immediately. "Looks amazing. You two always travel somewhere nice. Living the dream." Mason responded with smiling emojis and jokes about working hard. The truth was more complicated. His wife came from a wealthy family. They helped with business connections, investments, and opportunities. Nothing wrong with that. What bothered me was how differently support was viewed depending on who received it. When Mason benefited from help, people called it smart. When I provided help, people called it expected. A few evenings later, several relatives gathered at my parents' house to discuss final reunion details. I brought schedules, vendor updates, and registration numbers. The meeting started normally. Then one relative wanted another kid's activity. Someone else wanted extra transportation. Another suggested extending an evening event. Everyone kept throwing out ideas. Nobody mentioned the cost. Nobody mentioned the work. They just looked at me, waiting. Normally, I would start solving everything immediately. This time I simply said, "I can look into it." Then I stopped talking. The room stayed quiet for a second. Aunt Linda blinked. "That's it?" I smiled politely. "That's all I can promise right now." A few people exchanged glances. For the first time in years, I wasn't volunteering extra solutions before anyone asked. I wasn't automatically fixing every issue the moment it appeared, and people noticed. Not dramatically, just longer pauses, confused looks, small moments of surprise. Back at the office, Rachel noticed it too. "You seem different." "Different how?" "You pause before agreeing to things now." I laughed. "That's a strange thing to notice." "It really isn't." She sat down across from me. "For years, you've said yes before people even finish asking." That observation lingered in my head. Because she wasn't wrong. A week before the reunion, requests started arriving faster than ever. Extra guests, room changes, special accommodations, last-minute questions. I handled what actually needed attention and ignored what didn't. For once, I wasn't carrying every responsibility that landed near me. The surprising part? Nothing terrible happened. A few relatives solved their own problems. Others discovered their issues weren't urgent at all. Maybe I had been doing more than anyone actually needed. One afternoon, I attended a family barbecue connected to the reunion planning. Several relatives surrounded Mason while he talked about a recent investment opportunity. People listened carefully, asked questions, praised his decisions. I stood nearby holding a drink. Nobody asked about the conference my company had just completed. Nobody asked about the charity gala we had managed. One cousin eventually walked over. "How's reunion planning going?" "Still moving forward." "Good." Then he turned back to Mason's conversation. I wasn't angry. Mostly I felt detached. like I was finally seeing a pattern clearly. The person solving problems rarely gets attention. The person talking about success usually does. That evening, as everyone was leaving, my mother stopped me near the driveway. "Vanessa?" I turned around. She studied my face for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." The last few relatives were heading toward their cars. My mother folded her arms. "You've been quieter lately." I didn't answer. She stepped a little closer. "You don't seem like yourself?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked directly at me. "Is something wrong?" My mother's question hung in the air between us. For a second, I considered telling her everything: the reunion, the assumptions, the money, the way people talked about my business. All of it. Instead, I gave the safest answer possible. "Just busy." She studied me for another moment. "You've always been busy." I smiled. Occupational hazard. That earned a small laugh. Not a real solution, just enough to end the conversation. My mother eventually hugged me and headed inside. I drove home wondering why honesty felt so complicated around family. A few days later, one of my younger cousins called. No emergency, no reunion crisis, no request. Just a normal phone call. That alone felt unusual. "Hey, Vanessa," Noah said. "You got a minute?" "Sure." We ended up talking for nearly half an hour. School, work, life, normal things. Toward the end of the conversation, his voice became more serious. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For all the reunion stuff." I laughed. "You don't need to do that." "Actually, I do." His answer caught me off guard. "You make it look easy, but I know it probably isn't." For a moment, I didn't know what to say, because that was exactly it. People only saw the finished result, not the work, not the stress, not the hundreds of moving pieces. Noah continued. "Honestly, if you ever stopped doing it, I think everybody would panic." I smiled despite myself. "Maybe." "No, definitely." When we hung up, I found myself in a better mood than I'd been in weeks. One sincere thank you shouldn't have mattered that much, but it did, because it felt genuine, not automatic, not expected. Genuine. That weekend, I attended another reunion planning gathering, smaller this time, mostly cousins. The atmosphere felt different from the larger family meetings. Less pressure, less politics, more relaxed. Emily was there. Noah, too. A few others I genuinely enjoyed spending time with. For the first time in a while, I found myself laughing. Actually laughing. Not the polite smile I'd been wearing lately. Real laughter. At one point, Emily nudged me. "You seem happier today." Maybe because nobody's asking me to solve 17 problems at once. That probably helps. We both laughed. The conversation shifted toward old family memories, embarrassing childhood stories, summer vacations, grandparents, the kind of conversations that remind you why family exists in the first place. For a little while, I stopped thinking about budgets and logistics. I stopped keeping score. I stopped replaying old frustrations. I simply enjoyed being there. And honestly, that scared me a little, because it made me wonder if I'd been looking at everything the wrong way. Maybe most people really didn't know how much happened behind the scenes. Maybe they weren't taking me for granted intentionally. Maybe they simply assumed the reunion budget covered everything. Maybe they thought volunteers handled more than they actually did. Maybe nobody knew how often I stepped in financially. The thought stayed with me long enough that I started considering something I'd never seriously considered before. Telling them. Not dramatically, not to shame anyone, just explaining the reality, the actual costs, the time, the resources, the things nobody saw. Part of me wondered if that would change everything. Maybe people would finally understand. Maybe they'd appreciate the work differently. Maybe some misunderstandings could actually be fixed. The idea felt surprisingly hopeful. Later that afternoon, I stepped away to take a phone call from one of my clients. It only lasted a few minutes. When the call ended, I started walking back toward the patio where everyone was gathered. As I rounded the corner of the house, I heard voices. Mason's voice was the first one I recognized. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply froze when I heard my name. "Come on," Mason said with a laugh. A few people chuckled. I couldn't see them yet, only hear them. Then another unfamiliar voice spoke. I recognized it a second later. One of his wife's relatives. "Vanessa owns that event company, right?" "Yeah," Mason replied. There was a brief pause. Then he laughed again, the kind of laugh that told me exactly what was coming before he even said it. "Owns is a strong word." The group laughed, not loudly, just enough. I stopped walking. I was still around the corner of the house, hidden from view. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. Another part needed to hear what came next. One of his future in-laws chuckled. "What does that mean?" Mason laughed again. "You know how people make things sound bigger than they are." A few more laughs. I stood completely still. "It's basically party planning," he continued. "Weddings, decorations, vendor calls, stuff like that." His future father-in-law said, "Sounds like a lot of work." "Not really." Mason didn't even hesitate. Anyone could do it. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were new. Mason had always made comments, little jokes, small dismissive remarks. The difference was that this time he wasn't teasing me directly. He was explaining who he believed I was. And he sounded completely sincere. Someone asked about the reunion. I heard Mason laugh. "Honestly, that's the perfect example." "What do you mean?" "My sister organizes the reunion every year." "That's impressive." "No, that's my point." He sounded amused. "It's just a family event. People act like she's running some huge operation." A few people laughed again. "She makes spreadsheets." More laughter. "She sends emails." Another laugh. "Books some vendors." I stared at the ground. My grip tightened around my phone. "She acts stressed every year, but if she stopped doing it, somebody else would handle it." That one hurt. Not because it was insulting, because I suddenly realized he actually believed it. He genuinely thought the work was easy. He genuinely thought it had no value. And somehow, that was worse. For years, I'd made excuses for him. Mason jokes when he's uncomfortable. Mason doesn't understand the industry. Mason doesn't mean it that way. I had spent years translating his behavior into something easier to accept. Standing there, I ran out of translations. His future mother-in-law asked another question. "So, the reunion isn't your sister's business?" Mason laughed. "No." Then he added something that made my chest tighten. "Trust me, if it were a real business, she'd be doing something more important than organizing family picnics." The group laughed again. I didn't. I couldn't. Because all I could think about was the lawyer's office, the plumbing repairs, the family loan, the invoices, the weekends, the late nights, the staff hours, the money, the years. Years of helping him. Years of helping everyone. And somehow I was still standing here listening to my own brother explain why my work didn't matter. I quietly stepped away before anyone noticed me. Nobody called after me. Nobody knew I'd been there. I walked toward my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. For several minutes, I just stared through the windshield. My phone buzzed. A reunion notification. Someone needed another reservation adjustment. I didn't open it. A second notification appeared. Then another. Normally, I would have responded immediately. Instead, I let them sit there. The silence inside the car felt strangely peaceful. Not happy. Not peaceful exactly. Just different. For the first time in weeks, my mind wasn't racing through solutions. It was asking questions. Simple questions. Questions I should have asked years ago. Why was I working this hard for people who didn't respect the work? Why was I spending money nobody acknowledged? Why was I sacrificing time from paying clients for people who assumed I would always be available? And perhaps the hardest question of all, what would happen if I stopped? I had never seriously considered that possibility. Not really. The reunion existed because I handled it. That had been true for 13 years. Whenever problems appeared, I solved them. Whenever costs increased, I found a way. Whenever somebody dropped the ball, I picked it up. That was simply what I did. That was who I'd become. But sitting in that car, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. Enough to imagine an alternative. Enough to picture the reunion happening without me. Enough to wonder what would happen if, for once, I didn't rescue everyone. My phone buzzed again. Another reunion message. I looked at the screen. Then I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. And for the first time in 13 years, I seriously considered walking away from the entire thing. The reunion countdown had reached single digits. Normally, that would have been the point where my stress level doubled. Vendor confirmations, final attendance numbers, last-minute emergencies, the usual chaos. Instead, something strange was happening. I felt detached. Not careless. Not irresponsible. Just detached. I sat alone in my office one morning reviewing the reunion budget. A task I'd done dozens of times before. Only this time, I wasn't looking for ways to save money. I wasn't searching for solutions. I was simply looking at the numbers. Really looking at them. Line by line. Item by item. For 13 years, I'd treated most of those expenses as background noise. Now I started asking a different question. What actually belonged to me? The answer surprised even me. The registration software. Mine. The check-in equipment. Mine. The printers used for badges and schedules. Mine. The backup communication system. Mine. The signage equipment. Mine. Half the logistical tools being used for the reunion came directly from my company. No rental charges, no invoices, no reimbursement, nothing. I opened previous year's records, then the year before that, and the year before that. The pattern repeated every single time, thousands of dollars worth of resources, provided automatically, almost invisibly. I leaned back in my chair. No wonder everyone thought the reunion was easy. They never saw what it would cost without those resources. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Rachel stepped inside. "Everything okay?" I turned my monitor toward her. "Take a look at this." She studied the spreadsheet. The longer she looked, the higher her eyebrows climbed. "Wait." She pointed at several lines. "These are all company assets?" "Yep." "Every year?" "Every year." Rachel sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she shook her head. "I knew we helped." "So did I." "I didn't know we helped this much." "Neither did I. At least, not consciously. Somewhere along the way, it had become normal. So normal that I stopped noticing." Rachel looked at me carefully. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" I knew exactly what she meant. I just wasn't ready to answer. "I don't know yet." She nodded. No pressure, no lecture, just understanding. That alone felt refreshing. Over the next few days, I paid attention to family conversations differently. Not emotionally, practically. Whenever people discussed the reunion, they talked about outcomes, food, activities, photos, attendance. Nobody talked about systems. Nobody talked about logistics. Nobody talked about labor. They assumed those things simply existed. One evening, an uncle called. "Quick question." I almost laughed. Family questions were never quick. He wanted changes to hotel arrangements. I explained the options. He thanked me, then hung up. Not once did he ask whether I had time. Not once did he ask if the request created more work. The conversation wasn't rude. That was the problem. Everyone treated my help as normal, expected, permanent. I started noticing the same pattern everywhere. A cousin wanted schedule adjustments. An aunt requested seating changes. Another relative needed transportation information. Each request arrived with complete confidence that I would handle it. Nobody seemed malicious. They genuinely believed this was simply how things worked. The realization removed some of my anger, but it replaced it with something else. Clarity. People weren't taking advantage of me because they hated me. They were taking advantage of me because I had trained them to expect it. For 13 years. Back at the office, reunion emails continued arriving. This time, I didn't jump to answer them immediately. Sometimes I waited an hour, sometimes longer. The world kept turning. Problems didn't explode. People occasionally figured things out themselves. That observation kept repeating, and every repetition made me think harder. Toward the end of the week, several employees joined me for lunch. The reunion somehow entered the conversation again. One coordinator asked how preparations were going. I shrugged. They're going. Rachel smirked. That's the most neutral answer you've ever given. Everyone laughed. Then one of our newer employees asked a question. Simple, casual, completely innocent. What would happen if you just didn't do it? The table became quiet. Nobody meant anything by it. They were genuinely curious. I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. Because for the first time, I realized I didn't actually know. The employee looked confused. I mean, if you did nothing, what would happen? Nobody spoke. I stared down at my coffee, and somehow that question followed me for the rest of the day. What would happen if I did nothing? The question followed me everywhere, through client meetings, through vendor calls, through the endless stream of reunion notifications. A week earlier, the idea would have terrified me. Now it felt unavoidable. I sat alone in my office one evening after everyone else had gone home. The reunion was only days away. My laptop displayed 3 lists: company resources, company staff, company services, everything connected to the reunion. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was uncertain, because I was finally being honest with myself. The reunion wasn't being held together by family effort. It was being held together by my business. And my business wasn't free. I opened a scheduling document, then another. One by one, I began removing assignments. Not client assignments, family reunion assignments. No dramatic speech, no angry emails, just decisions. Rachel knocked softly before entering. She glanced at my screen. Have you decided? I nodded. I think I have. She looked over the staff schedules and equipment reservations. You okay? I exhaled slowly. No. Then I smiled. But I think I'm going to be. Together we reviewed everything connected to the reunion. Registration equipment, removed. Check-in support, removed. Staff assistance, removed. Emergency vendor coordination, removed. Almost every major system depended on resources my company had quietly provided for years. Nobody in the family had ever asked where those systems came from. They simply existed. Until now. I drafted a short message. Not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. For the first time in 13 years, my company would not be providing services for the Carter family reunion. Anything family members arranged themselves would remain untouched. Everything connected to my business would be withdrawn. I read the message twice, then stopped. A familiar feeling settled in my chest. Guilt. The same guilt that appeared whenever I considered putting myself first. But lately I'd started recognizing it for what it was. Fear. Fear of disappointing people. fear of breaking expectations. I looked around the office I'd built from nothing, the company my family barely understood, the employees who respected my work, the clients who valued my time. Suddenly, the decision felt simpler. I wasn't taking something away. I was ending something that never should have been automatic. I sent the message. For several seconds, nothing happened. The world didn't collapse. My phone didn't explode. Rachel smiled. Feel different? A little? A good little. I thought about it. Yeah. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. The next few days moved quickly. Equipment was reassigned to paying clients. Staff schedules returned to normal. Nobody on my team questioned the decision. One coordinator actually smiled. About time. The reunion kept getting closer. Messages continued appearing in family chats. Questions, assumptions, updates. I responded less and less. The strange thing? Nobody seemed to realize what was happening. They still believed everything would somehow come together. Just like it always had. The night before my departure, I packed a suitcase, a few clothes, a camera, a hiking jacket. My passport sat on top of the dresser. This trip wasn't really about travel. It was about space. Space away from expectations. Space away from responsibility. Space away from being everyone's solution. Before sunrise, I carried my suitcase to the car. My phone already contained several unread reunion messages. I didn't open them. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Very few people knew I was leaving. Nobody knew exactly where. As I pulled away toward the airport, the first light appeared on the horizon. Banff was waiting. My family had no idea. My phone started vibrating before I even finished breakfast. I was sitting outside a small cafe in Banff. For the first time in weeks, nobody needed anything from me. No vendor questions, no schedule changes, no group chat emergencies, just fresh air and silence. The phone buzzed again, then again. Family reunion chat. 27 unread messages. I put the phone face down. 5 minutes later, curiosity won. I opened the chat. The first thing I saw was confusion. Does anyone know where registration packets are? A few messages later. Who has the final guest list? Then, some of the hotel rooms aren't showing up. Nobody sounded angry yet. Just confused. People still assumed someone would solve everything. They just hadn't figured out that the usual someone wasn't there. I spent the next couple of hours walking around town. Every so often, I checked my phone. Not because I planned to help, because 13 years of habit doesn't disappear overnight. Around lunchtime, Rachel called. Have you looked at the messages? A little. Want the office update? Sure. She sounded like she was trying not to laugh. Several vendors had contacted my company that morning. Not because we were involved anymore, because they couldn't reach the family members who were supposed to be handling things. One vendor still thought our staff were managing check-in. Another expected our equipment team to arrive. A third was waiting for instructions nobody had sent. Did you answer them? I asked. Nope. Good. They were politely informed we're not participating. I smiled. For once, the consequences belonged to someone else. Back at the reunion, confusion was turning into panic. One cousin texted me privately. Do you know what's happening with registration? I didn't answer. A few minutes later. Did someone lose the guest list? I ignored that one too. By mid-afternoon, photos started appearing online. The registration table looked crowded. People were standing around waiting. Several relatives seemed to be searching through stacks of paper. I immediately recognized my father in one photo. He looked stressed. Not because he was incapable, because he'd never had to manage this part before. For years, he simply showed up and enjoyed the reunion. Now he was responsible for things he barely understood. A little later, Emily texted me. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't asking for help. She was giving updates. You would not believe this. Try me. The hotel situation is a mess. What happened? Some reservations were never finalized. Of course, those confirmations had always gone through systems my company maintained. Systems that no longer existed. A minute later, another message arrived. Mason is running around like his hair is on fire. I nearly laughed. For years, Mason had acted as though event planning was easy. Now he was discovering what happened when hundreds of moving parts needed coordination. The updates kept coming. Guests couldn't find information. Schedules were inconsistent. Vendors were asking questions. Nobody seemed to know who was in charge. And for the first time, people started making comparisons. Didn't this usually run smoother? Who handled registration before? I don't remember these kinds of problems. Emily later told me several relatives had started defending me. Actually, defending me. One uncle apparently said, "Vanessa normally takes care of all this." Another relative replied, "Maybe we never realized how much she was doing." It had taken a disaster for some people to notice work that had been happening for 13 years. As evening approached, I found a quiet spot overlooking the mountains. My phone finally stopped buzzing. For the first time all day, I relaxed. The reunion was happening. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it was happening, and I wasn't responsible for fixing it. Then another message appeared from Emily. No joke, no update, just a photo. I opened it. Several relatives were gathered near the entrance of the reunion hall. In the center stood Great-Aunt Eleanor. Everyone in the family respected her. What caught my attention wasn't Eleanor herself. It was what she was carrying. An old storage box, weathered cardboard, faded tape across the top, the kind of box people keep for decades. I zoomed in. People around her looked confused. A few seemed surprised. One looked nervous. A moment later, another text arrived. Nobody knows why she brought that box. Then a second message followed. But whatever is inside it, she says the whole family needs to see it. My phone rang before I could call Emily back. It was Emily. I answered immediately. What's happening? For a second, all I heard was background noise, people talking, chairs moving, a microphone squealing somewhere in the distance. Then Emily lowered her voice. You are not going to believe this. I sat on a bench overlooking the mountains. Try me. Great-Aunt Eleanor opened the box. My stomach tightened. What's in it? Paperwork. I blinked. Paperwork? Folders full of paperwork. That answer somehow made me even more curious. Emily explained that Eleanor had gathered everyone into one of the meeting rooms. The reunion was already chaotic. People were frustrated. Nobody knew why she wanted everyone's attention. Then she set the box on a table and started pulling things out: receipts, invoices, copies of checks, printed emails, old reunion budgets, records going back more than a decade. Why does she have all that? I asked. No idea. Keep talking. According to Emily, Eleanor calmly organized everything into stacks. Then she asked a simple question. Does anyone here know how much Vanessa has personally contributed to these reunions? Nobody answered. Most people assumed the answer was little or nothing. Just volunteer work. Just family helping family. Then Eleanor started reading numbers. The room got quiet. One receipt showed a catering shortage I had covered. Another showed rental equipment paid through my company. Another revealed hotel deposits that were never reimbursed. Then another. And another. Emily paused. I could hear voices in the background. What happened? I asked. You know that moment when a room realizes something all at once? Yeah. That. Eleanor wasn't emotional. She wasn't angry. She was simply presenting facts, which somehow made it more powerful. One document showed a budget gap from years earlier. Another showed transportation costs. Several revealed last-minute vendor payments, costs that disappeared before anyone else even knew there was a problem. Because I had paid them, year after year, without announcing it, without keeping score. Emily continued. Aunt Linda thought some of those things were donated. I shook my head. Nothing had been donated. Someone had paid. Nobody had bothered asking who. As Eleanor worked through the documents, people began asking questions. Wait, Vanessa paid for that? She covered this too? When did this happen? The answers were right there. Dates, amounts, copies of checks. Everything documented. Everything preserved. At some point, my father sat down without saying a word. Emily said he looked stunned. For years, he talked about the reunion as if it simply happened. Now he was staring at proof that told a different story. The numbers kept growing. Not one huge payment. Hundreds of smaller ones. Budget shortages, vendor problems, emergency expenses. Things nobody remembered because the crises never reached them. They reached me. Then Emily lowered her voice again. Mason isn't saying much anymore. That got my attention. What do you mean? He tried making a joke. And? Nobody laughed. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could almost picture it. Mason standing in a room where the story had suddenly changed. A room where people were finally connecting dots. His confidence had carried him through most situations. But confidence doesn't work very well against paperwork. Emily told me relatives were questioning assumptions they had held for years. Why was Vanessa always handling everything? Why was she paying for things? Why did nobody know? Why did nobody ask? The room wasn't angry anymore. It was embarrassed. The kind of silence that comes when people realize they overlooked something important for a very long time. Eventually, one of my cousins asked a question loud enough for everyone to hear. Emily remembered it word for word. Why didn't Vanessa ever tell us? The room went quiet. No explanation. No defense. Just silence. Then another relative quietly spoke. If she never told us, why did none of us ever ask? And according to Emily, nobody had an answer. Emily called me again the following morning. The chaos hadn't disappeared. It had simply settled enough for people to start talking. Eleanor basically turned the entire reunion upside down, Emily said. I laughed. That sounds like her. She told me relatives spent hours going through the documents. Some were shocked. Some embarrassed. One uncle insisted nobody could have known. Another immediately replied, "We could have known if we'd ever bothered asking." For once, I wasn't there trying to smooth things over. I was sitting beside a mountain lake hundreds of miles away, and honestly, that felt wonderful. The calls started coming later that week. Not requests, not emergencies, actual phone calls. The first came from Aunt Linda. She sounded uncomfortable. Vanessa? Hi, Linda. A long pause followed. Finally, she sighed. I owe you an apology. I stayed quiet. I honestly never realized. I should have. For the first time in years, I believed someone meant it. Several relatives called over the following weeks. Some conversations were awkward, others emotional. Not everyone apologized, and I wasn't expecting them to. The biggest surprise was my father. One evening he called and, after a few minutes of small talk, quietly said, "I should have paid more attention." I guess we both got used to it. No. His voice was firm. That's not the same thing. A moment later he added, I'm sorry, Vanessa. It didn't fix everything, but it mattered. Mason was different. For weeks, I barely heard from him. Then one afternoon he showed up at my office. No warning, no audience, just him. Can we talk? Sure. He sat down and rubbed the back of his neck. I was wrong. I waited. I said a lot of stupid things. That's true. A small laugh escaped him. Then he pulled an envelope from his jacket. A payment. For what? For some of what I owe you. It wasn't much compared to everything over the years, but it was the first time he had ever acknowledged the debt. I accepted it. We didn't suddenly become close. But at least we were finally being honest. Back at work, life became noticeably simpler. Without the reunion consuming weeks of free labor, my company grew faster than ever. We signed larger contracts, expanded our staff, took on projects I would have turned down before. Rachel joked that removing one unpaid client had become our best business decision. She wasn't entirely wrong. Months passed. Family gatherings continued. The difference was subtle, but important. I stopped acting like the family manager. When problems appeared, I didn't automatically solve them. Sometimes other people stepped up. Sometimes things stayed messy. Life went on. I learned how to attend family events without running them. Honestly, I had forgotten what that felt like. Then spring arrived again, and with it came plans for another family gathering. The group chat came back to life. For a moment, old instincts started creeping in. Then a message appeared from one of my cousins. Not an assignment, not an assumption, a question. "Vanessa, would you like to help with planning this year?" I stared at the screen. Simple, ordinary, easy to miss. But it felt completely different. "Would you like to help?" Not, "Vanessa will handle it." Not, "Can you take care of this?" A choice. For the first time in 13 years, I had one. I smiled and set my phone down before answering, and that question changed more than the answer ever could. Before I go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been the person everyone depended on until they stopped noticing how much you were doing? What finally made people see it?